Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Erik Skopil. I'm Matt Prehm, and we're shifting a little bit of the format, or I guess at least the topics of the podcast. It's always going to be heavy football recruiting, but football season's over. We've kind of dived into kind of some outlooks, recaps of the 2024 season, and now as the sport has officially closed its doors for business for the 2024 season, we're opening business for basketball. Men and women both are off to good starts. I think that's a very fair assessment. Would you say it's fair to say both teams are off to a great start?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, and I would say even exceeding expectations to probably a certain degree for both teams too.
Yes, I would agree with that too. Uh, we're going to start with the women here. 14-5 overall. They flirted with the top 25 for a little bit in November. It's to your point, Erik. I think this is the one that's for sure exceeding expectations. At least for me, who
hmm
doesn't cover the team, and just from the casual fan base perspective, 6-0 start, and then they lost 3 of their next 4 games. But now they've won 7 of their last 9, and 14-5 or 14-5 overall. They've got a solid 5-3 Big Ten record. They've got some games where they've beaten some good teams in non-con. They've hung with some really talented teams. But what's just our view of this season at the halfway point or so? It feels like they're right along kind of where they were a couple years ago of being in the thick of it for the tournament.
Yeah, this is not. I guess the big picture first point is this is a big step from where they were last year, which is in and of itself important to note. I mean, it was
Right.
an absolute disaster last year. So for Kelly Graves to keep his job, I think they had to have a really, really strong improvement, and they've been that so far. And with essentially a month left in the season, they would be in the tournament's field right now if the season were to end. They're 36 in the net. ESPN has them as a 9 seed. CBS has them as an 11, but that I don't think CBS has updated their rankings or bracket projections, I should say, since the Iowa game. So there's maybe a little more data there that would improve that standing. But either way, they would be solidly in the field most likely if the season were to end right now. And I think just being able to say that with the month of February right around the corner tells you the step this team has taken. And we can get into a lot of the particulars, but this is just a far more competitive team. You think about a year ago, and again, I don't think comparing it to last year's team is really a great barometer because last year's team was terrible. But just to set a little bit of a precedent, like last year's team won 2 conference games the whole year. This year's team has 5 wins already, and um, we can get into all the specifics of how that's happening. But just broadly, I think that's impressive, and not necessarily knowing how Oregon would fare in this conference against these new schools. I think I've been impressed with the way they've been able to handle business because, with the exception of playing USC back in early December, every other Big Ten game, the other 7, have been against teams that had really never played before, with not with any regularity, and they've been very, very competitive against, I would say, the traditional Big Ten teams. Really, only Ohio State, I would say, beat them soundly, and that was a game that they were able to rally back and make moderately competitive at the end. And that was an Ohio State team which at the time had not lost all season. So um, I think early indications are very positive for what this season and team has been. And um, yeah, do you want to dive into some of the specifics, man? I know you had a couple questions. I've got a
Yeah, I
couple
mean, I
thoughts.
just think like looking at this, 7 different players have led the team in scoring in a game this season. I think that speaks to the balance that they have offensively. Is that a fair assessment? Because I look at it and there really isn't any player that dominates the scoring. Deja Kelly leads the team with 11 points. That in and of itself is a surprise to me that it's so low. Peyton Scott is the only other player in double figures, but then they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other players that average 5 or more points. Is this a team that just much like the men, where they truly say like any given night it could be anybody that leads the team, and is that what's kind of led to some success this season, where they've just got more options of who can do the scoring?
Yeah, I think the thing that's so, you know, a year ago, and I keep doing this thing where I look back, they had like 2 players that could score and basically 6 players they were comfortable playing. If there is, and we can get into this, I think that there is a level of, I'm gonna say, concern or an area that they really haven't fleshed out this season. It's been the rotation. I think that's because, like, genuinely, like, player 1 through 9 on the roster, there's not a whole lot of separation, and even like player 8 through 12 on the roster, there's probably not a lot of separation. So to your point, Matt, like, I think you do go into it being like, most nights it's probably going to be either Kelly or Scott or Che that leads the team in scoring, but there could be a weird night where like Sophia Bell hits a bunch of threes, or Elisa Muvius is a little bit more impactful on offense, and somebody else is kind of able to carry some of the scoring. I will say, I think Kelly's played a lot better in Big Ten play than she did in non-conference play. She had a really nice start where she played, I think she had over 20 points, maybe the season high against Baylor, and then just kind of was kind of up and down from there in non-league play. She's got it going a little bit more recently, and I think the one thing we're talking about, Prisha, she shoots like 15% from 3.
Yeah.
This team is a very poor 3-point shooting team, and that's another area that is kind of illustrated by like your leading scorer is just somebody who should never, and it's a guard too, which makes it strange. She just basically shouldn't be shooting threes. She had like a stretch with like 13 straight games without a 3-point shot made, and then she just finally recently ended that streak. So 3-point shooting is not necessarily a strength, but again, on any given night, I think pretty much anybody can have a night to carry the team. And frankly, any given night, somebody off the bench could go from being, last game I played 4 minutes, this game I'm playing 22 minutes because of matchups or the rotations and how they kind of work out. So I think that's been a real positive. And I think just like the broad strokes of why this team has been good, I think comes down to a couple of things. I think first off, 2 veteran guards in Scott and Kelly who have over 2,000 career points. That's like a really nice baseline of experience and of confidence and of players who've like kind of been in these moments before. Kelly playing obviously in the ACC, Scott at Miami of Ohio. But these are just 2 very experienced guards. And then the other thing is, this is a far better defensive team than I had expected it would be. 5 in the Big Ten in scoring defense, which is a conference that has some of the better scoring defensive teams in the country. They just beat Iowa, scoring 50 points in the game, 50-49. You know, like that was Iowa's lowest scoring total, I think, since 2013 or 2012. I had the stat over the weekend, and this is the first time an Oregon team had won scoring 50 or fewer since 2006. Wow. Since 2006. So the defense, I think, has been a big step forward, and I think that's been another reason why they've had a little bit more success.
You mentioned the rotation. 12 players play 10 or more minutes per game. That's pretty wild to think. Yeah. Now, like Katie Fizo hasn't played all 19 games, but she's been away from the team for some personal reasons. And there's another player that's been playing like 11 games, but she's missed time because of injury. But yeah, it's 12 players. And I'm curious, like, you've covered Kelly Graves long enough. Like, this will get cut down eventually, right? Like, we'll start to see it happen, or no?
I asked him that question, and I don't think he knows the answer to it, because that is right. I mean, historically, he likes to get to 8, and I said, I asked him this, I think last time we did media, like a week ago, and he was kind of like, honestly, Eric, there's not enough separation from everybody to make the cuts, and so I think he wants to get it down to 8 or 9, but I think that feels like there really are 11 or 12 players that are all vying for minutes, and I don't know how sustainable that frankly is. And you do see it, like even against Iowa, they kind of cut into it a little bit more, and a couple of players, I think they played 10, and a couple of players only played a couple minutes, so it was closer to maybe that number. But yeah, I mean, I think for all intents and purposes, they're comfortable playing 10 players, which is a really weird place to be. And frankly, I don't know if it almost feels like it takes a half sometimes for them to figure out who needs to be playing. And not that they've had a lot of slow starts, but they have been a team that, kind of similar to the men, have needed to rally a lot, especially in this most recent game and a couple of earlier games in conference play. I think some of that has to do with, like, they get to halftime and they figured, okay, these players fit. That's not to say they didn't have a good idea going in, but maybe it gets solidified during the game. And it does seem like, from night to night, that group could be a little different than it is the previous game.
What sticks out to you, maybe that we haven't touched on yet, from just how this team has improved from how this team is operating on a game-to-game basis. What sticks out to you that's like a marked improvement for this team right now?
I just say I think Elisa Mevius, who statistically wouldn't leap out and stand out as like your best
Right.
player, is arguably like their best overall player because she's undoubtedly their best defensive wing player. She's not quite matching the steal output she had at Siena last year, which was like over 4, which was never going to happen at
Ridiculous.
this level. But like I think it's at like 1.5 right now. She's, I believe, leading the team, and she's offensively like a little bit more. Like she could have a big night, and she's hit some of the bigger shots this season. And I just think that was a player who I didn't really know what to do with going into the season, and probably didn't expect to be a huge component. And I don't think I'm the only person who watches this team regularly who's like, she probably makes about as big of an impact as anybody. And then the other one I would note is I think it seems like Filipina Chase finally getting healthy.
Yeah.
And her last like 5 or 6 games has been about what you would expect to see from her, which is a lot of like 12.8 rebound games where she's playing about 30 minutes. And she, in the early part of the season, was playing maybe 15 minutes a night. Like every now and then she'd play 22 when they were playing a good team, but a lot of nights she was playing like 10, 12 minutes because she was coming back from a foot injury she suffered over the summer. That's been a big difference maker. And I think you see that being really impactful against some of these better teams because she has size that even, and now is it the most reliable size to score down in the post? Not always, although she had some pretty big baskets against Iowa. But just her size and her ability to rebound and change shots at 6'8", that's been a real difference maker for this team. And that wasn't a component that was always there in November and December. And now in January, has she's kind of looked a lot more like the kind of player she did a year ago, and she was an all Pac-12 player.
Yeah, I was gonna say like there's a couple wild cards here where if Deja Kelly can get her percentages up a little bit further from 3 and start rounding back into form, and Filipina Chase post play down low, and then if they can find one more wing consistent scorer like this, to me from the outside, I've watched a handful of their games lately. I watched the Iowa finish. I watched the Purdue game, the Penn State game on the road. It feels like look, I'm not going to come out here and say, oh, they're going to win the Big Ten and go, they're going to go through the tournament and win it. But like, it feels like they've got the capabilities of whether it's in the Big Ten tournament or if they get to the NCAA tournament, where it only takes one game, but you can knock off a higher seed. And I'm not going to say they're going to make a run to the Sweet 16 or something like that, but this feels like they've got the firepower. If things click, they could be really competitive against one of the better seeds in the Big Ten or the NCAA tournament.
How about this, Matt? I think what I'd say is they have this really difficult stretch coming up here. I was just looking at it coming in.
Yeah, I was going to get to this.
Yeah, but let's even frame what you're saying around this. Of like, there's 8 games in a row now coming up, 4 at home, 4 on the road, where they're playing teams that are currently in ESPN's field for the NCAA tournament. 8 straight games, 8 teams that are top 50 net teams, 5 of which are ranked. This is a really tough stretch. And to your point about like going into the NCAA tournament and hanging with anybody, I think going into the season, when I looked at this stretch, I went, boy, it's going to be hard to win 2 or 3 games from this stretch. That would be a stretch from that stretch, I guess. I'm now looking at it going like they could win half these games. They could win even more than half. And that right there, if they're able to do that, would solidify their tournament standing pretty clearly. Like if they came out of these 8 games at 5-3, which is our current record, and they were 10-6 with 2 games to play at the end, which are against, I think, Rutgers and Washington. Which are winnable. And they could be, let's just say, 12-6, 11-7. They're certainly in the field, and they probably have played themselves up, maybe even a seed line, because they are playing some really tough teams coming up here, including Indiana at home on Friday, where, like, I agree. I think you go into each of these matchups. I don't expect them to beat Maryland or UCLA, which are top 10 teams nationally. I think it's going to be hard against the Michigan schools on the road on their upcoming road trip. Those are 2 ranked teams. But like if they could just find a way to win against Indiana this weekend, at home against Washington, on the road at Minnesota, at Nebraska, like just find a way to win those sort of games against teams that are kind of in their same range in the net ranking, again, they would give themselves a really nice, position, I guess, to make the NCAA tournament. And to me, that's kind of a way I'm measuring all this. And again, because of how they played and the veteran presence and how they fight, like it does not have been a team that's gotten really blown out this whole season. I think Georgia Tech's the worst loss, and that was by 16. That's a ranked team that might, that'll compete for the ACC championship. Um, like this has been a team that's been very competitive every night in and night out. And so this next 8 games will define whether or not they get into the tournament. They probably need to win more than they lose to do it. And I feel like they have a really good chance to do that. I'm not 100% sold they will, and it's possible this kind of comes crashing down. But the way they play defensively and just kind of the veteran nature of the way this team is constructed, I think they have a shot to do pretty well here through a stretch, which will define kind of, I guess, the success of the year.
Yeah, they got 5 home games left. Eric said starts with Indiana this Friday, and then stretches on the road against number 21 Michigan State and number 24 Michigan before coming back for 2 top 10 games in 3 days' time. February 6th, number 8 Maryland, and then February 9th, a Sunday, 1 p.m. game against number 1 ranked UCLA. And then they play Washington at home, and then they go on the road again February 16th to play at Minnesota. But that UCLA Maryland stretch, Eric, and I guess probably to an extent Friday night against Indiana. Crowd attendance has been a hot topic for the men. I think visually on the screen, watching them on TV for the women, it seems like there's more fans in the last couple of years. And obviously, when you have the year that you did last season, it's really difficult to convince people to come and watch this team play.
Yeah.
But that UCLA and that Maryland game, I'll be real curious to see, because remember, the women just a couple years ago, right up to COVID, and then the first year after COVID, they had one of the higher average attendance marks in the Pac-12. And when it was Sabrina and company, they led the conference in attendance by a wide margin. I'm curious to see what kind of atmosphere those can be. And look, just as important as showing up and your team's playing, it's playing it in a hostile environment. And can we see some magic happen with a big fan base behind a team who's, well, I'm not going to say they're going to be either of those teams. I will be kind of surprised if they beat either of those teams.
Yeah.
But maybe a packed house or a fuller crowd and a team that's playing well collectively together could make for an interesting case for an upset bid. But you're right. Like, these next stretch of 8 games will really dictate it. And I hate to say, like, you got to go 3-0 on the road against the 3 ranked teams that you're going to play, but kind of feels like that has to happen.
Well, yeah. I mean, just if you parse it through a little bit more clearly, and I agree that UCLA and Maryland at home are probably unlikely. That does probably, to get to 4 or 5 wins, require you do pretty well in these road games, because I guess to simplify it, if you say you're going to beat Indiana and Washington at home, which are no locks at all, those are 2 very good teams. But if you say, for the sake of argument, you're going to win those 2 games, that means you're going to have to win 2 or more games on the road. And again, running through all that, Michigan State, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, those are going to be tough games to win. And the other part here, Matt, maybe to close the segment, we are getting into the part of the season where Oregon's going to start facing a lot of teams that have players that started their careers here. So Sydney Parrish comes into Eugene this week. Then they go and play Grace Van Sluten's team, I think the last couple of days of February. Later in the month, Angela Dugalich comes to Matthew Knight Arena. So they've got three players in the next 5 games that started their careers here that have transferred and are at least starters on very good Big Ten teams. So that's kind of an interesting thing to kind of monitor here for those that are kind of following the totality of the conference.
Regardless of what happens, this team's in discussion for the tournament. I think it's a marked improvement. It's one that should be discussed and celebrated, because this team was in dire straits last year, and there was a lot of external noise around the program, and whether they get in or not, it's an improvement this season. And you'll know better than me, but real quick, agreement, like, the trajectory of this program is more in line with where it should be, of going up than kind of going down. They're not all the way back. They've got plenty of room to go, but at least we're seeing the trajectory go up now with this program, where the last couple years it felt like it was going down.
Yeah, I mean, I think they had a worse win-loss record each of the last 3 years. It will certainly be better than last season, and like I said earlier, the next 8 games will determine if it feels like it's kinda headed where it needs to be, I think. And then there's the question of kind of who's on next year's team and how all that comes together. Because in women's college basketball, like men's college basketball, it's really almost impossible to project how it's gonna come together, but you certainly feel like this is a step in the right direction, and we'll see how much longer Kelly Graves wants to be doing this, how much longer he's. I don't think he's going to be fired, but what is the long term trajectory also kind of depends upon what he wants to do and who's kind of leading this program.
All right, let's take a quick break. We come back, we'll dive into the men's side of things. We just wrapped up an important home win over the rivals last night. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Now, shifting gears here towards the men. I think the expectation for the men was to be a tournament team going into the year. And to your point, Eric, though, I think we can still say this team's probably exceeding expectations from where we were at the start of the season. Because remember, they lost Jermaine Couisnard, they lost N'Faly Dante. They're basically their two go-to guys last season, and those two carried Oregon to the NCAA tournament. And obviously, they had help behind them, but they did all the heavy lifting, and you had to replace both of them. And guys have stepped in, filled voids. Other newcomers have arrived to provide more help, and they're 15-3. They're a top 15 team in the country. I think it's like the 8th straight week now they've been ranked inside the top 15. Their net ranking is incredibly high. I don't think they're playing like one, but their resume data points say they are, but they're a 2-3 type seed in the NCAA tournament. And I don't know if I'm probably the biggest half glass full guy for Oregon basketball. I didn't think that this was going to be the area they were in at this point in the season. It's been quite a ride. It's been I think a nervous breakdown sometimes at times because of how tight these games have been. But nonetheless, they've found ways to get there, and they're in the thick of it for the Big Ten.
Yeah, you're right on the. There's been a lot of stress. They've been stress-inducing as somebody who's watched them a lot, and I think the thing that stands out for this team is kind of like the women. Like defensively, they're pretty consistent. And last night wasn't their best game, but like I went to the Purdue game and came away thinking that was like one of the best defensive performances the team has played maybe all year. And it's just been kind of the ups and downs of can they hit a perimeter shot or not, which is also very similar to the women's team that I cover. And I think, Matt, and you can correct me on this, but it really feels like for this team to take that next step and I know, maybe their data points aren't representative of what we're seeing with our own eyes on the court, but it feels like to take that next step, they need TJ Bamba and Brandon Angel to look like the players they looked like last night, especially offensively. I was looking at the numbers and just kind of my memory of when watching them play. It had been a minute since either of them had been that assertive or that consistently capable of at least finishing baskets around the rim. And TJ hitting some perimeter shots. I thought that was a really big game for Oregon to win, because they're beating a rival in Washington, a rival which I know has a terrible Big Ten record, but it's pretty scrappy. Like
they're actually pretty good.
Yeah, they're pretty competitive. I've watched them a couple of times in games, in non-conference play, and was like, okay, they might have a bit of a team this year. Has not played out that way in Big Ten play. So beating them was obviously important, but I thought winning in a game where neither Jackson or Nate were really offensively very involved early. I know Jackson hit a couple shots late to kind of get into double digits, but I just thought the way Brandon and TJ played last night was really encouraging, because in the Purdue loss, I felt like, gosh, if just one of them could be, because Brandon started pretty hot in that first half, or at least he was able to score a little bit around the rim. I just thought, gosh, if they could just get one of these guys going a little bit to help out with what Jackson and Nate are able to offer, they get over that hump. So I think finding one of those guys every night and having them step up, I feel like that's pretty important going forward. And it was good to see both of them have big games last night.
Yeah, Bamba in particular. I mean, teams are not guarding him when he's on the 3-point line, and he mentioned that, and He said last night he felt it was very disrespectful to do that. I asked Dana Altman, was like, how do you kind of coach around when the numbers say let one of your players shoot threes? And he was very blunt about it. He's like, yeah, if we did our own scouting report on ourselves right now and we were playing us, we would be doing the same thing. We would be asking TJ Bamba to shoot 3-pointers. And I'm paraphrasing there a little bit, but the reality is Bamba has to get it going shooting. And Dana mentioned it. He's a way better shooter than his percentages show. His time at Washington State, his time at Villanova would back that up. He's never going to be a sharp shooter like a Pritchard or a Shellstead on this year's team or Anthony Mathis, but he should be able to consistently knock down at least the open jumpers. And last night against Washington, he did that a couple times. He went 3 of 9, 9 threes being the most he's ever taken in a game. I think some of that was by design by Washington. But you're right. Like if he can just be consistent and knock some of these down, and Brandon Angel can be assertive and attack the basket and be the efficient player that the most efficient player in college basketball that he was last year at Stanford, this team's ceiling gets extended. The house gets remodeled and goes higher up because now all of a sudden you have a low post stretch big man too, and Biddle, who we should talk about here in a little bit. But you have Shellstead, who's back to what everyone expected him at the beginning of the year. Bartholomew is a microwave off the bench, and now you add in those two seniors and Biddle and or not in Biddle, but Angel and Bamba, and now it's kind of like truly who do you defend? Who do you take away? Because if you double one thing, they're going to have two other options open. And I agree with you. Like moving forward, those are going to be the two guys that I think really dictate where this team goes, because Shellstead will continue to be Shellstead. Biddle will continue to be Biddle. I think Bartholomew is going to continue to be kind of the microwave off the bench. But if you can get one or two more options in your rotation, this ceiling goes up for Oregon. And I will note, like, I thought Angel was really good defensively last night. He struggled a little bit the last couple of weeks defensively, but then in particular Bamba, this gets lost in the shuffle because of how poor he shot against Purdue. But he had a career high 4 steals and was guarding basically the entire time Braden Smith, Purdue's All-American junior point guard. 3 of them, I think, came in the second half. He matched that total last night against Washington with 4. So in 2 games, he's had 8 assists or 8 steals. This is a guy that can be your annoying defender at the top of your defense or on the wing. And quite honestly, like they haven't had that the last couple of years. And so to your point, these two guys could really decide, much like the women have an 8-game stretch that's really going to decide the season. The way Oregon plays and what they get out of Angel and Bamba the next couple of weeks could really dictate whether this team's a 2 or a 3 seed in the NCAA tournament and a dark horse for an Elite 8 run, or they're a team that's in that 6 to 7 range because they lose a couple extra games that they shouldn't have lost.
And just to stay there for a second, it does feel like it's not crazy to think that they could either one or both could get hot and play like this, because we know based upon what they've done at other schools, TJ Bamba has been an alpha perimeter offensive player on pretty good Washington State teams and at moments at Villanova. And as you said with Brandon Angel, this is somebody who was one of the most coveted portal players in the country this last year for a reason. And it's just been a matter of getting everything out of them. And it feels like, you mentioned taking that next step, it feels like historically under Dana, this is about kind of where we start to see things turn. And I kind of wonder, and who knows, I know they play this weekend, but I kind of wonder if they turned a bit of a corner here this last game after the disappointing game against Purdue. And we're going to kind of see a bit of an ascension here with those two guys, because again, the track record's there for both of them to do it. And it's just a matter of maybe finding a rhythm. Maybe they needed to be kind of some sort of reinforcement of like, hey, yeah, this works for this team, because there was a really ugly stretch for both of them, especially offensively leading up to it. Biddle is somebody I think we should talk about because he's probably, I mentioned Elisa Muvius is maybe the best overall player on the women's team. I think Nate Biddle's probably the most impactful overall player on the men's team. Go ahead.
It's an interesting development because all year it was how are they going to replace N'Faly Dante, and Biddle has said it, Shelstead has said it, Tracy had said it, and more importantly, Dana Altman said it like, hey, don't be N'Faly Dante. Don't be the back to the basket big man. Be yourself. Don't try and be 100% what N'Faly Dante was, because that's not your game. They're different players, and they were different players. Biddle is a better jump shooter. Dante's a stronger player on the block, but call me crazy. I kind of feel like Biddle's emulating and basically doing what Dante did. Now there's not the dunks, like he's not dunking like Dante did, but his low post game, his post ups, his hook shots, his back steps to get layups are all there. He gives Oregon an anchor in the middle offensively to get the ball into, and when he touches it, he's a really good passer. He averages almost 2 assists a game, and less than 2 turnovers. He's not taking nearly as many threes, it feels like, as he's previously had. He's anchoring down at the key, and he's had a revelation offensively. But I think the big step here is the defensive side of the basketball. He has turned into a wall, and he's now averaging over 2 blocks a game. I think he's second in the Big Ten Conference. A lot of opponents have talked about the impact he has on altering shots, whether it's getting hands on them or not. And then Dana's talked about it a ton of just how they've really leaned into him and have asked him to do a lot. And I think for the most part, he stayed out of foul trouble. He had 4 fouls against Washington last night. I think 2 of those were just egregious calls that never should have been called in the first place, but he was there nonetheless. But he's avoided it most of the year of staying out of foul trouble. To the point where he was a 5-star, remember, coming out of high school, and he's the highest rated Oregonian ever to play at Oregon. He was viewed as an NBA prospect. I think you can argue that he probably should come back because he'll have a chance to further enhance his stock. But I wonder, like, if he does go pro after this season, he probably has a good chance of hearing his name. And I don't know if that was on the bingo card November 3rd or 4th, whenever the season started.
Yeah, defensively, I was just really struck against Purdue, and I know the defense wasn't the problem in that game. They lost the game. That part's disappointing, but they played a really strong defensive game, and so much of it was early. Kaufman Wren, I think, is the last name of the Purdue big. I know he finished with pretty big stat line, but he had a really hard time getting anything going in that first half. And I think Biddle finished the game with 6 blocks. That's right, Matt? And I think 3 or 4 of them were on Kaufman Wren, who's, again, one of the better low post players in this conference. I found in that first half in particular him to be such an impactful player on that side of the court, and his ability to, no one's going to be, the chase down blocks of LeBron James or of somebody like that who's an elite athlete. No one's comparing it to that, but just the space he's able to eliminate, and the shots he's able to eliminate from seemingly, out of position. That stuff really stands out. He's really come into his own in terms of being a rim protector and shoot. Like I think in certain situations, maybe a step up as a rim protector from N'Faly. And again, N'Faly, the superior rebounder, a much better offensive player around the basket. But I'm really impressed with what he's been able to become. And frankly, like, I was up in the cheap seats watching the Oregon Purdue game, and the Purdue fans were pretty annoyed with how, with the play that Biddle was, the plays he was able to make in terms of kind of rejecting some of those shots and what he was able to eliminate. So I think, like, to your point about the NBA, I don't know about that, but I think just pretty clearly watching the Big Ten as much as I've been able to, and him, he's one of the better big men in this conference. And that can be such a thing to lean on, especially as you're trying to make a run to win a conference championship, to be a big seed in the NCAA tournament, but just to have a reliable big guy. And again, that was not something that was a surefire, absolute that he was going to be that this year. So I think that development has been huge. And I mean, another thing that, like, just as somebody who grew up in the state of Oregon, it's fun having arguably your two best players on your men's
From
basketball
Oregon.
team be from Oregon, because that's just hasn't. I can't think of the last time that you could make an argument like the two best players are from the state.
So it's been so long, Eric, that it kind of hits the were we too young to truly remember this point.
Yeah, exactly.
Freddie
'Cause
Jones and Luke Jackson in 2001.
I
Freddie was a senior,
that,
Luke was a sophomore.
that popped in my head, and I went, but wasn't Luke Ridnour on that team?
He was, but he was from Washington.
I know. So, but are those the two best players then? Because Luke.
Oh, true.
That was what
I
I.
get what you're saying. Yes.
That was exactly.
Yeah, Luke was the
my head
third.
went.
He was not the Luke Jackson yet. He was kind of like the really good secondary piece.
So it's been a long time since that you could say that. So that part is just kind of, I know it's a really small component of it, but as just somebody who's.
Oh, it's very cool.
It's cool. It's really fun to have to be able to say that. And I know Mookie Cook hasn't quite gotten to that point yet too, but just to have the state actually producing talent that then comes to Oregon and is really impactful NBA caliber players, like, you don't really get to see that very often here.
And I think Oregon, this is a really good problem to have. Oregon also has a really good backup center in Prehm Cook, and Dan has talked about it. I'm surprised we have not seen it yet of Prehm playing center and Biddle playing power forward. They've never done it all year yet. I'm surprised they haven't tried to see if it works or not. But Prehm, it's a really difficult problem because, to your point, I agree. I think Biddle he's probably not the best big man in the Big Ten, but he's in the discussion. And so it's really hard to want to take him off the floor for long stretches. If you can play him 25, 30 minutes a game, you're going to do it. You should do it. But Prehm Cook, in his own right, has shown the ability to do some damage down low. He played 11 minutes last night against Washington, had 13 points, had a stretch where he scored 7 straight to give Oregon the lead midway through the second. And then when Biddle picked up his 4th foul with, I think, like 6 and change left, he came in and quickly scored 5 points in like 2.5 minutes. They have a very legitimate big man that's quite different than Biddle. You know, Biddle shoots threes, is a jump shooter, has really perfected that Dirk Nowitzki kind of one-step fadeaway jump shot that he takes inside the mid-range. Cook is like a bull in a china shop. He wants to be aggressive. He wants to play hard. He wants to dunk on you with 2 hands. And kind of to the point of what we were talking about with the women, if they can get some catalysts to step up, like Prehm Cook might be one of those wild cards where if Dana knows that there's very little drop off between the two of them, at least offensively, and they can play differently, you know, Cook might be that guy that steps in and all of a sudden down the last 6 or 7 games of the regular season and into tournament play plays lights out, and you're kind of like, whoa, where did this come from? Who is this guy? He's having an unbelievable moment. But look at the times when he plays. I know Illinois isn't a great showing by the team, but he had 20 points in 19 minutes on 8 of 11 shooting in that one. He was the only bright spot in that loss. Again, last night, 13 points in 12 minutes against Washington. He's had his moments where he's played really well. And remember, he had an injury to start the year, so he's coming back into form. He had 11 points in 14 minutes against Alabama in that win. So that's another one to watch of just the depth piece and how they maneuver things. And I do think, unlike the women, we're starting to see the bench get cut, Eric. Raheem, I don't know what's going on with Raheem Moss. He's not on the injury report. He did look like he hurt himself at Ohio State a couple weeks ago, has not played since. He played January 9th, played 7 minutes in the first half, and look, he left the game with an injury, never came back, didn't play against Penn State, didn't play against Purdue, and then has not played against Washington. Dana said last night like they were prepared to play him if they wanted to, but he just didn't. Mookie Cook is also not playing. He hasn't played in over a month's time. And then Jamari Phillips, he got in the first half against Purdue, but the next time he had played was January 2nd against Illinois. So I think we're starting to see this rotation of 8 guys kind of start to form. It's Biddle and Bamba and Angel, Shellstead, and Tracy, starting with Barthélemy, Kwame, and Supreme Cook. An 8-man rotation. I probably would like to see one more guard step up. Who that is, though, I don't know if there is one that's worthy of playing a bunch of minutes, though.
I was surprised watching the Purdue game that Jabari did get some run there, especially was Moss on the injury report for that game?
No, he was not. He's not been on the injury report at all.
So that was what surprised me, was that he was their extra guard that kind of came in and was just kind of pestering on defense and again, not particularly. I think he threw up a long 3 at one point, kind of out of sequence that Dana wasn't really jiving with. But yeah, that part is interesting, who that extra guard off the bench is, and it's a huge luxury to have someone like Barthélemy who can just come in and, as you said, just kind of cook and score some baskets. But it would be, I think, beneficial. And again, I don't know if they want to play 9 players or not, but it would be beneficial just to have another guard that they can bring in there, whether that's Phillips or Moss.
Oregon schedule, wrapping it up here, goes to Minnesota on Saturday, a 1 p.m. game on the Big Ten Network. And then next week they play 2 games at UCLA on Thursday, a 7:30 game. That's a big one. Sunday the 2nd, they play at home against Nebraska. And then it gets real difficult. They've got a road trip to Michigan schools. They go Michigan, Michigan State, both teams in the top 25. Rutgers comes to town later on. That's a team that's got multiple first-round NBA dudes. Their record's not very good, but the talent there is high. Road trip to Iowa and Wisconsin, and then they close out home games with USC, Indiana, and then at Washington to close the season. They still got 12 games left on the schedule. You look at this and think, they're in the tournament to get there, to make sure you have the last in seed of the tournament. You probably need to win 3 more games, 2 more games to get yourself in. That's going to happen. And then you're playing for seeding. And, depending on what happens at Michigan and Michigan State and what happens at Iowa and Wisconsin, if you can hold serve at home and win 2 of those 4, you're probably looking at a team that's going to be a 4 seed or better and playing in the Seattle pod in whatever region that they're in. And that's what you want.
I would just say, I think the way I look at it is the road to a 1 or a 2 seed is there based upon what's available on the schedule. It would just take probably winning almost every one of those games with how competitive those seed lines are going to be this year. Just kind of looking around the country going, like, there's a lot of teams seemingly kind of in the same range as Oregon right now that are like, hey, they have the ceiling to be one of the top 2 seeds. They could also, to your point, be a 4 or 5 seed. It seems critical to try to get in that top 4 seed line if you can. If you could play in Seattle and on the West Coast for that run, that would be really huge for a lot of reasons. But so 12 left. You think they win 8 games and then have a decent showing in the Big Ten tournament? That's a top 4 seed.
I think so. I mean, as long as you can't lose to USC at home, you kind of really can't lose to Rutgers at home. That's another one that you have to win. Nebraska is probably another one where I know that they're probably a tournament team, but they're a bottom 4 team in the league. You need to hold serve at home. You hold serve at home, and you pick off the Washington road game, and you win at Minnesota, and then all you got to do from there is just win 1 or 2 of the at UCLA, at Michigan State, Iowa, and Wisconsin games, and you're probably going to be in the top 4. I mean, they've got 8 quad 1 wins already. That's the
crazy.
most in the net ranking history for Oregon, in the regular season at least. And this is why you moved to the Big Ten, because every single team in the Big Ten is in the top 101 for Ken Pom. I understand that's not a tool used for the NCAA tournament, but it's a tool widely used by every men's basketball coach in college basketball to look at scouting reports and look at scheduling and whatnot, the league in the Big Ten gives Oregon a ton of opportunities for resume building wins. Minnesota will be one. UCLA will be one. And their resume, while they may not show it on the court all the time, their resume stacks up with the best out there. And it's going to take a near impossible run to get a 1 seed. They basically can't lose the rest of the way. It's not going to happen. They're going to lose a game or two, 3, 4, who's maybe, but 2 is very real. That's a very realistic, attainable goal that this team could get. And there's something to be said. I remember going to Spokane when they were a 1 seed in 2016 and seeing a humongous crowd at that game. They had a really tight one against St. Joe's that came down to the very last play or two, and it was a benefit when half the arena was rooting for Oregon. You go to the next year, and when they were, I think, a 3 seed, and they played in Northern California, they played at, I think, the Kings Stadium, and again, they had a really tight second round game, and it was ironically enough against Dan Hurley. He wasn't at UConn then, but it was Dan Hurley, and Oregon had a huge crowd, and those situations factor in. And if you can get yourself a high seed where the fan base is engaged and wanting to come watch you play, and you're playing on the West Coast and drivable distance to your largest fan base, that's how runs in the tournament can start. When you have a favorable draw and you have a home-like environment behind you in tournament play. So yeah, it's possible. It's going to be there for Oregon to take, and we'll see it in the next couple of weeks. Just like the women, they're going to hit a stretch here where they've got to go 5-3 to really kind of secure this idea. But it's there, and it's possible. We'll cover both teams on duckterritory.com through the postseason. And until the next time you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.